Good morning and welcome to BSME, British Schools in the Middle East Professional Learning Webinar Series. Today's webinar, Creating a Sustainable Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Strategy for Your School, is being recorded and will be available to BSME members. On the bottom right-hand corner of your screen is a white box called the chat pod. You can make comments or pose questions here, which will be addressed as we go or at the Q&A session at the end. Let's use the chat pod now to say good morning or where you're listening from. Got a couple people typing. Just give them a second. Hannah in Oxford. Good morning, Hannah. Coming in from Aman Jordan, from Nan at SRS, and Nav from Dubai. That's great. Looks like we're coming through fine. So today's webinar, Creating a Sustainable Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Strategy for Your School, will be delivered by Hannah Wilson, Angie Brown, and Mike Lambert. Hannah?
Right, good morning, everyone. So Olivia and I have been speaking for about a year now. I was due to come out to meet you all at the Head Teachers Conference in March and actually do a panel around diversity. And then obviously due to lockdown, that didn't happen. So I met with the central team a few weeks ago and we were talking about the programme that Angie and I have written and we are delivering from the UK and how it might be of interest to your head teachers across the schools group. So let us introduce ourselves first of all. Angie, over to you. If you want to introduce yourself, please.
Great, thank you, Hannah. My name's Angie Brown and I am a former education leader and English teacher. I worked in the UK in schools for about 20 years and I gravitated towards working with young people who were struggling with mainstream education and then became a head teacher of a pupil referral service, an education other than at school service, a special school, and then moved into working in a state-funded Steiner school where I was a head of an all through from 4 to 16, and then moved to a mainstream secondary school in South Gloucestershire. So worked in rural South Gloucestershire as a head of a large secondary school where I then moved in to become deputy CEO of a small multi-academy trust. And that was the last role I had before moving into working pretty much full-time as a coach and as a trainer for people who felt that there was a ceiling in their leadership. So working with women who found it difficult to progress to senior leadership and working increasingly with Black, Asian and minority ethnic colleagues who wanted to progress into senior leadership. And I did that work alongside setting up my own business, which is called Nourish Collective, and I host an online space for women who are interested in creating school systems and schools that nourish people, that enable leaders and children to flourish. Most recently, I've just written a book about ethical leadership, and it's called Lighting the Way, The Case for Ethical Leadership in Schools. And I guess I touch on all of those things. I touch on how we can create schools that nourish people, but also how we can do those things ethically. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion form a really, really big part of that work. And what I wanted to do, actually, and what both of us are going to do, is just give you a sense of the ways in which that work has manifested itself and the impact that some of that work is having. And what I thought would be helpful for you is to hear some of the context in which I've been delivering my diversity, equity and inclusion work. I work across a huge number of schools and with schools in very different contexts, but some of the more relevant work to you might be the work I've been doing with independent schools. So a couple of years ago, I started working with a former independent school, which had an increasingly diverse population of young people from Somali backgrounds and African Caribbean backgrounds. And the leadership of the school reached out to me because there'd been some allegations of institutional racism made against the leadership of the school and against I guess, a history of a curriculum that children who were in year 11 and were in the sixth form had experienced. So the leaders asked me to come in and do some mediation work and to listen to the young people, to hear them, and then also to put forward some strategies that the school leadership could use to move things forward. And that was a piece of work that we did over several months. I think it had its limitations because actually what it didn't necessarily do is give the leaders really sustainable approaches. And so when I was asked by a different independent school trust to work on a similar issue, I set about talking to them first about the training and support that staff had had up until that point in dealing with allegations made by young people, in being able to hear the allegations that were being made by young people, and in working with their families from diverse backgrounds. So in my more recent work, we have looked at leadership strategy, we've looked at training and support, we've looked at unconscious bias training for staff, and we've also looked at providing some of those leaders with the mediation skills that they're going to need and the cultural competency that they're going to need to be able to support young people who have so far experienced an education that has been viewed through a particular lens, and those young people might say through a lens that was very white European centric. Hannah, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Angie. So similar to Angie, I was in the education system for 19 years. I trained Anna Kent and worked in a boys' grammar school and then moved to London. And I've worked in very diverse schools. But in those very diverse schools, I've always worked in very white and very male-heavy SLT structures. And when I became a deputy head, and I was the only woman on an SLT, that is when I co-founded Women Ed. And Women Ed is a grassroots gender equality movement. And you might be aware that there's a Women Ed MENA handle, and it's now a global initiative. And we published a book about sort of like women leadership journeys in the education system and how to navigate the glass ceilings. Angie and I met literally as Women Ed started, and we began to have conversations about the lack of intersectionality in that space, because at that point, Women Ed was quite a white female space, quite a white feminist kind of like narrative. And we talked about the need for the conversation to be much more diverse than it was. So when I left London and became the startup head teacher of a co-ed school, a mixed school in South Oxfordshire, my deputy head and I co-founded Diverse Educators. And the idea of Diverse Ed is that it is an intersectional conversation. So for those of you who are on Twitter, you'll be aware that there's been quite a flurry of grassroots activity in this space. There's Women Ed, there's BAME Ed, there's LGBT Ed, and there's Disability Ed. But my deputy head said to me, like, Hannah, I can't go to 4 events. I said, well, don't go to 4 events, Benny. And she said, but I'm a woman, I'm a brown woman, I'm a bisexual woman, and I'm also a disabled woman. So I need to choose which bit of my identity I'm going to lead with each Saturday, and I need to go to one event about 1/4 of my identity. Can we please create an event where we bring everyone together? So that's the kind of the history of Diverse Ed, and it started off as a grassroots event once a year. But since leaving headship and going independent, and I'm now a leadership development consultant, coach, trainer, and facilitator, Diverse Educators has become more formalised, and I've got partners who now have helped me sponsor a website. Alongside being a deputy head in London and a head teacher in Oxfordshire, I bid for and secured funding from the Department for Education. So for the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a grant called the Equality and Diversity Grant, where teaching schools could bid for money to support people with protected characteristics on their leadership journey. So I've run some of the women in leadership programs, but also some of the Black and Asian minority ethnicity leadership programs, which Angie has actually delivered and coached on as well. So it's just a little bit of my kind of positionality. Obviously, my lived experience is I'm a white woman, I'm a straight white woman, I haven't got a disability, and I'm cisgender. So I'm very aware of that when I'm doing this work. And I always position myself as being an inclusive ally and standing alongside people and listening and learning and helping to amplify the conversations of people from diverse backgrounds. And some of the impact work that I wanted to share with you. So I was a leader that was salaried doing this work in 2 multiple academy trusts that were quite big. But since I've left and I'm working independently, some different MATs have approached me, and I'm working on some similar initiatives, but now as an external critic, which gives you a very different position, because you can be much more objective, I think, when you're not actually being paid by the CEO to do the work, and you're not salaried. You're coming in as the expert, you're coming in as the critical friend. So with AET, who some of you might now is one of the bigger trusts over in the UK. I'm working with 3 colleagues, and we have created 4 pillars where we are addressing 4 of the protected characteristics, and we're looking at creating channels of work where we're supporting the school leaders with developing this work to support their staff but also their students. And we're thinking about the kind of the legacy and the sustainability of that. So some of the strategy involves making it stick sessions where there's going to be an ongoing CPD commitment, where there's going to be short and sharp sessions to kind of like revisit ideas and terminology. There's some wider raising awareness activity, which can go out to all staff, and it's pre-recorded, which means it's flexible and anyone can access it. We've also created some horizontal systems such as affinity groups, where you have got a women's group led by women for women, but advisory groups where you've got the head teachers and the chairs of governors and the HR teams working together to look at policies and practices. We've set up coaching circles to create that safe space for people to share their experiences. And as Angie said, part of it is also unconscious bias training for the recruitment panels throughout the trust. And the next step, we're talking about AET, and Angie and I have also talked about how this might be a piece for BSME, is how we can create a student diversity championship programme as well, because a lot of young people are very keen to be involved in this work, and they're trying to navigate this space as well. So if you want to do some student-led work, that would also be an option. So as I mentioned, Diverse Educators has now become more of a formal entity. So we are a registered organisation, and we've got a very simple mission statement. It's about being where you are celebrated and not tolerated. And the word tolerated is a deliberate choice, because as you'll be aware of from the British values, we need to teach tolerance. And for me, tolerance really jars me, because no human being wants to be tolerated. We want to be accepted, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be celebrated. So our position is around the fact that how can we actually encourage schools and school leaders to celebrate the richness and the diversity of their staff bodies and their school communities, as opposed to tolerating those differences. And I think that's just that reframe is really important. Some of the things that you'll be able to find on our website, and I'll pop the website address into the chat for you in a second, is we signpost out to the relevant laws and policies that are informative for the people doing this work. We've got the updated SRE guidance coming out at the moment, for example, and that's an opportunity for us to think about diversity, equity and inclusion within our PSHE and SRE curriculums as well. So the first thing to kind of think about, really, the Equalities Act and how it frames this work, is thinking about the 9 protected characteristics. And one of the questions I always ask people to consider is, how visible are these 9 protected characteristics in your school community? And obviously, within your region, there'll be some that are more hidden, and we absolutely understand why that is. But when you think about the equity of these 9 protected characteristics, is there a hierarchy? Are there some you are leading with? Are there some that are highly visible? And are there some that are perhaps hidden? And how can you create that equity within the protected characteristics? Because one of the things that we hear a lot is that a lot of schools are now committing to this work, but they're perhaps leading with 1 or 2 of them. And if you have a protected characteristic that's invisible or is hidden, you do feel quite unseen and quite unheard in your school. So how can we consider the universality and the holistic kind of approach to diversity, equity, inclusion, where we're thinking about all the different protected characteristics and we're leading with that inclusive kind of nature? One of the things we do is that we amplify voices. So we have a series of events, and a lot of our events are virtual and they are recorded, and I can signpost you out to that free CPD that might start some of these conversations in your school, and you can share them with your teams. But we also have a blog, and we've got a number of international teachers, some of them are from your region actually, who have published the work that they're doing in their own schools. So just a way of us raising awareness and sharing best practice across the community. Here are the contact details, and it does inform some of the work that Angie and I do together, but it's also a separate space that you might want to signpost your staff to, because how we've structured the website is the 9 protected characteristics are basically different categories, and we then signpost and showcase the organisations working in that space. So say, for example, you were looking specifically at disability within your school, you can go to the disability section of the website, and it will then detail to you all the organisations you could engage with who are sharing resources and running training for that particular protected characteristics. So that's just a little bit of context around diverse educators. Over to you, Angie.
Great, thank you, Hannah. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time this morning talking through some of the areas that I find school leaders often struggle with. So just to give you a bit of context, a bit of learning, and also some key terminology. And this is because it links to the programme that Hannah and I are running, but also because I think these are things that are coming up in schools at the moment. So the first thing is to talk about unconscious bias. There is a lot of debate at the moment as to whether unconscious bias training is the route that schools and school leaders should be taking. And I come down on the side that it is a great starting point, because it is overwhelmingly clear that unconscious bias seeps into pretty much everything that we do. And that includes leaders who are white and leaders who are brown. Unconscious bias affects the decisions that all of us make about recruitment. It affects not just the education system, but it affects our healthcare system. It is present in our criminal justice system in the UK, in America. It is evident that people from ethnic minority backgrounds are often disadvantaged. There are numerous studies that talk about the power of racial biases and the ways in which these biases affect almost all of our decisions. White applicants for jobs have been found to be 74% more likely to have success than applicants from ethnic minorities with identical CVs. University professors have been found to be far more likely to respond to emails from students with white-sounding names. And indeed, it's been my experience that even when doing blind recruitment, I've met candidates who have changed a name that sounded as though it wasn't a white European name in order to feel as though they could get themselves to the shortlist. In the US, doctors have been found to recommend less pain medication for Black or Latino patients than for white patients with the same injury. And interestingly, I was doing some research the other day and looking at the statistics around death in childbirth for Black women and for white women. Black women are 5 times more likely to have complications with childbirth than white women. White participants in the study were found to perceive Black faces as more threatening than white faces with the same expression. And these are kind of blind studies. These are things that are relevant for us because they are unconscious and they are deeply, deeply rooted in all of us. So I would say for any school that is thinking, what route should we take? Should we be looking at unconscious bias? That there are articles out there telling us that we ought to leave this work aside and do something else. It's a great starting point when you are starting to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your setting. And then the other thing I think that's really worth thinking about is your cultural competence. And this is because this is something that I've met in lots of the schools I've been working with over the last couple of years. Cultural competence sounds, again, to me like a slightly iffy concept. And I think it needs to be handled quite carefully. So I think it's not about saying we're all culturally competent, because this work is ongoing. It is endless. It comes up for all of us whenever we meet somebody who we feel is unusual, who doesn't meet our expectations, who sits slightly outside of the kinds of people that we tend to surround ourselves with. And again, cultural competence work is not about being a white person doing cultural competence work or being a Black or brown person doing that work. It's about all of us confronting the limits of our expectations, our biases, the things that we keep hidden, and also being aware of the fact that most of us are included in very, very small and cozy bubbles, and we rarely step outside of them. So cultural competence is the ability to be ethical in all of the settings in which you're in. It's the ability to recognize that you are in intercultural settings a lot of the time, and to bear in mind people's personal and professional backgrounds accordingly. Cultural competence is the ability to really reflect on ourselves and be aware that we carry a set of cultural values, we carry a set of norms, we carry a set of beliefs about the world that we know to be true, and that means that we are inadvertently making judgments about other people who don't carry those same values, beliefs, in the way that they live their lives. And so there is an implication there that we need to make respectful, reflective, and reasoned choices about our language and behaviour when we're meeting other people. Cultural competence is ultimately, though, about valuing diversity. As Hannah said, this work is about being celebrated. It isn't about being tolerated. So cultural competency opens us up to the richness of humanity, the creativity of humanity. It brings us closer together, and in recognition of the fact that we're all human beings. And as I say, it has no end. I am stunned by the limits of my cultural competence when I find myself in new situations. And I think it's the humility to kind of sit back and say, oh yeah, okay, I might have a blind spot here that makes cultural competence such a rich and worthwhile use of time and training, and thinking about how that can be run through the school and how you can develop that within your leaders and teachers is really, really worth the effort. Just a little bit of key terminology I wanted to share with you this morning, because again, I think there's quite a lot on social media. It talks to these terms and doesn't really unpack them, and I think people are stepping away from using them because they don't want to use them inaccurately, and they don't want to fall foul of something. People hate not knowing what to say, and I think the biggest piece of learning I've had around this diversity, equity and inclusion work is that as a Black person, it's often easier for me to know what to say because I have lived experience. And sometimes I find my white colleagues really stumbling over language because they don't want to get it wrong and they don't want to inadvertently upset somebody. So these are some of the things that I think are probably not particularly contentious, but they are helpful to start to include in the way that you're at least thinking about diversity, equity and inclusion work. So the first term is ally, and I feel very strongly that Hannah uses this brilliantly and is evidently an ally in the field. An ally is just somebody who supports others, who maybe are a group other than the one they would identify with. And I think the important thing about allyship is that it is about acknowledging the disadvantage and the oppression of other people and other groups, but it's also about the willingness to take risks and be supportive of those people or groups, even when it might lead to your own discomfort. So really that willingness to kind of raise your hand and say, I see something and I don't think that this is okay, and I'm an ally for that group or for that person. There is an active quality to allyship, which isn't simply about thinking, oh, actually, that's not fair, that shouldn't have happened, that looks like discrimination. Allyship has an active quality, and it, depending on where you are, you will feel able to raise your hand and stick up for somebody to a greater or lesser extent. Institutional racism is something that people really, really fear naming because there is something litigious around it. If we were to say that we had or were running a school in which there was evidence of institutional racism, it would be an incredibly exposing and vulnerable position to take. And so I like to think and talk about institutional racism to the extent that it is something that we are all responsible for. It exists in all of our institutions, all of our public institutions, to a greater or lesser extent. This is not about us harbouring something, holding something back from other people, hiding the fact that there might be things that are happening in our school that come as a consequence of the institution. Effectively, institutional racism is the way in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups. And so wherever we have a behaviour policy or an examination policy, a homeschool agreement that disadvantages groups, we have to look at the institution and say, oh, okay, maybe there is something we can do about this. I think institutional racism obviously has significant connotations because it has impacted law. In the UK, the murder of Stephen Lawrence led to the Macpherson report, which led to claims of institutional racism being made about the police force. And so it is significant, but the impact of addressing institutional policies or practices that disadvantage groups is, again, profound work. Structural racism is something that we are all, again, part of. This is something in our society that, whether you are white, black or brown, we all are responsible for trying to look at and trying to dismantle. Structural racism is a lens which allows us to see that, you know, there is white privilege to a large extent. There is a dominance of white leadership. There is a dominance of a consensus of a particular way of leading, of working, of being in the world. Structural racism, again, is not an attack on any particular group. It's just a responsibility that we all need to take to look at whether or not we live in a society which is largely framed through one particular lens. And so these kinds of conversations are not conversations I would be saying you need to be having with young people. You need to be having with parents, not at all. These are key bits of terminology that I think we should all be thinking about in our own lives and thinking about and beginning to explore in discussions that we're having with our colleagues and with our peers. And the last term I wanted to talk about is white privilege, because it's contested at the moment. There's been a lot of talk in the UK about critical race theory and about teachers being really clear that teaching critical race theory to students without presenting any other theory would be seen as illegal by our current government. And I don't know any schools that are teaching critical race theory. I don't know any schools that have time to teach critical race theory, if I'm honest. But I do think that there are some aspects of critical race theory that are really helpful for adults to consider as we are leading institutions. Now, white privilege is a concept that is part of critical race theory, but also stands outside of it. And it refers to the unquestioned and unearned set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices that white people are allowed to experience as a consequence of being white. White privilege is not about class. It's not about your access to wealth. White privilege is just about the ability to do certain things and not necessarily be conscious that you're doing those things. Some examples could be that you are able to walk around a department store without being followed by security. An example might be that you are able to drive your car in any neighbourhood without being stopped by the police and perceived to be either in the wrong place or driving a car that looks like it's not your car. So white privilege is not anything to do with the level of the level of success you've had in life. It's not to do with your background. It's to do with what whiteness affords you in our society. So I just wanted to share a few bits. Hannah and I talk a lot about language. We talk a lot about these key concepts in this programme, but it's also a starting point for any of you interested in the work to go and explore some of this further for yourself and start to have those conversations with your colleagues in school.
Thank you, Angie. And just to share a moment of reflection myself. So as a white leader in working in very diverse schools, and for the last 5 years I've been in this space and in these conversations, it's made me really reflect on and realise that have I been part of the problem in some of those schools? And that's quite a tough thing to look at yourself and say that to yourself. But actually, when I was that head of year sending black boys home for infringing a uniform policy, was I actually upholding racism within that institution, within that structure? I was following the policy and I was being a leader and being compliant, but was I actually thinking about and challenging that policy? And I think that awareness that I've grown of my own privilege as a white person, I've sat in space with 70, 80 black leaders telling me what it's like for them to be in the school system. And I've been embarrassed. It's made me really, really aware of the experiences that some of my colleagues have had. And that's what then drives me to do this work and to be an inclusive ally and to be a bit louder and a bit prouder about that work, because actually the injustice really, really shouldn't be tolerated at all in our system. So we wanted to just bring Mike in at this point. So Mike reached out to us and asked if we could squeeze him into our first cohort, because he saw the programme, he was really keen to be involved, and he's in our first cohort of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Leaders Programme. And I think it's really important to hear from one of your colleagues from the region. So Mike, over to you, please.
Thank you ever so much, Hannah and Angie, and good to see colleagues who I recognise in the audience today. So welcome to this session from me. So Hannah's asked me to speak for about 5 minutes about why we chose this programme that Hannah and Angie are running in particular, but also to think a little bit about the context for us as British schools in the Middle East, which is a very, very interesting association, I suppose, that was set up some time ago now, back in the late 70s. So Dubai College was one of the sort of founding members of the BSME, nothing to do with me, but back in the day. And for us to really kind of reconsider where we sit now as British schools in the Middle East and what that looks like in terms of life in modern Britain, and also our schools in the modern countries in which we currently exist. I suppose it's really, really interesting again to reflect. So I suppose I'm completely the opposite end of the spectrum here. So I am not the expert. I'm not here to tell anybody anything at all. In fact, I'm the absolute novice in this particular area. And I suppose, you know, I've got to be honest today, as I was in the first session that I did with Hannah and Angie, I'm quite nervous, I suppose, about talking to you as fellow heads of schools on this particular topic in this area because of my inexperience. I am one of the those white colleagues who perhaps has been fearful about getting it wrong, and therefore I think, like a lot of us, has believed that probably the safest thing to do is to avoid the topic entirely. I also think we've been in a challenging position in British schools in the Middle East, and also British international schools more generally. I don't think this is a Middle East issue per se. In that with the arrival of the new British Schools Overseas Inspection Framework 4 years ago now, there was a huge amount of controversy and I suppose concern about how we were supposed to implement the Equalities Act 2010 and the 9 protected characteristics within the jurisdictions in which we work, whether that would be legal, whether we'd be endangering our staff and our children if we did. And so I think a lot of us just steered clear of that particular topic. And I actually think what we probably all should have done at that time is actually engage more proactively with the topic. But just to give a little bit of context, if you don't already know, and I know some of the audience members do already know this, in early July this year, some 4 months after the killing of George Floyd in March of this year, an Instagram account was established called @UnsettleDC. And if you haven't seen it yet, I strongly recommend that you go and have a look at it. So it's an Instagram account. We can put that in the chat for you, the handle there, @UnsettleDC, and it will be a hugely educational experience for you if you haven't already seen it. So the account took the form of several other thousand similar accounts that were set up over the US and the UK in response to the killing of George Floyd. And I'm not going to spend too long talking about the account, but do have a look. Some of you may think that you're immune to that. That might never happen to your school. It's something unique and specific to Dubai College. I think what was really, really interesting, I spoke very openly to the British schools in Dubai about this at the start of July. And actually 3 or 4 other schools within Dubai, all of whom are BSME members, had comparable, they hadn't had the Instagram accounts, but they'd had comparable approaches from former alumni, but they'd kept it very, very quiet. And it had been going on for about 4 to 6 weeks before UnsettleDC started. So I stumbled across this account, and it grew and grew to 2,500 followers pretty quickly, with 240 or so posts over the course of about 4 to 6 weeks. And we didn't have a clue how to respond or to react, to engage with the people who'd set up the account, to listen attentively to our current students, to our current parents, to our former students, and to our former parents, as well as our staff. We were literally sort of left out in the cold. And I think we probably could have all have done a lot to support one another more with how to proactively and supportively, well, A, not be in that situation in the first place, but B, when an account like that sprung up, respond in a proactive way. So speaking again, very, very honestly with you as colleagues, I suppose two things happened. Firstly, I was personally incredibly, well, I was actually shocked and surprised. So that was my honest first response. I had absolutely no idea that there was this depth and level of feeling among our alumni and some of our current students as well. And then after the shock subsided, I was really profoundly sad as an educational leader that somehow I was in charge of a school where this had been going on, and quite a lot of it was historic, but some of it is current, and that somehow I didn't know that it was going on, and I didn't know how to respond. So I had a pretty big sort of existential crisis and soul searching that went on pretty much throughout the course of the summer. But I think secondly, and I think Angie touched on this earlier as well, is the concern that exists, I suppose, from a commercial perspective as the CEO and the head of a school. So there were accusations leveled against Dubai College that we were a fundamentally institutionally racist organization. And I suppose we have a dual responsibility. One is there's the personal, human, heartfelt educator who happens to be sitting at the top of an organization. And then the other is of the commercial leader that's got a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that this organization continues. And how do you respond in the right way whilst protecting the reputation of the school, but also actually thinking about protecting anybody who's experienced anything like this during their life. So it was a huge conflict. And I felt that I simply did not have the tools at all to deal with this particular situation. The first thing that I did do, and I think it's probably the only good thing that I did at the time, was reach out to absolutely everybody, including Olivia at BSME. I spoke to Colin Bell at COBIS. I spoke to Sue Bishop at the HMC. So those are the three big school associations that we're associated with. A, to reach out and seek support, but also to say, look, this is what's happening to us, and it may well happen to other schools. What are we doing about it? And this conversation obviously had already been going on with Hannah and Olivia for some time anyway in the background. So why do I think it happened to us? I think it could happen to any school because we have not been actively engaging with this. And I do think it's really, really important for BSME schools to come together on a program like the one that Hannah and Angie are running, because our context is quite unique and specific, and the legislation that exists in Dubai is quite different to Bahrain, is quite different to Kuwait, is quite different to Jordan. And yet we do have a shared commonality of being British schools in the Middle East to be able to actually talk about these issues as British international schools in the Middle East, which perhaps, you know, when I went to the first session with Hannah and Angie, my UK sort of contemporaries and colleagues on the course had a lot in common insofar as they were all in the UK. So I think I'm the only one in the first cohort that's an international school member. And as a consequence, I'd strongly encourage actually this BSME group to follow this path, because we would have a lot in common to talk about and to share as well. So how did I land on this particular program that's being presented today? Well, Dee Saran, who's my amazing Deputy Head Learning and Teaching, is actually part of the sort of broader Women's Ed network. She'd been to a few events already online. She found the leadership program for me and said, because I'd come up with a 5-point plan, which is, I think it's pretty good. We came up with it over the summer, but I guess it comes back to the old phrase, you know, theory without practice is empty, and practice without theory is blind. And we'd sort of come up with something. We had no experience of this. And Dee said, Mike, you need this. These are good people who've done this. They've walked this path. You need to go on it as the leader, and then we'll cascade it as a school. So that's how I stumbled across the course. The first session was eye-opening. I think there was a huge amount of kind of reflective and stunned silence at various points, a huge amount of sharing at various points. The course is very, very well mapped throughout the course of 12 months. So this isn't a drop in for a day, do a course, there you go, you've ticked the DEI box, you're sorted, you've done your inset for the year. It's not that at all. This is about how do you embed a sustainable program over time, giving you tangible steps. Wherever you sit, it hooks you in to the legislation and to the practice. And for me, that is the huge strength of the programme. So I guess I'm here to endorse it, but I'm also here to kind of talk personally. And if there is anybody listening who wants to reach out to talk about the DC experience, I'm very happy to hook up afterwards as well. So that's it for me. Back to Hannah.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you as always for your honesty, your humility, and your vulnerability, because I think how Angie and I position this course, as you know, is about the fact that we need to do the inner work as individuals, as humans, to be able to do the outer work as professionals. And I think you really captured that in your testimonial there. So thank you so much. So back to you, Angie, about framing why this programme is needed.
Yeah, I think, thank you again, Mike. I think Mike's framed it very well, but essentially we believe that every school needs to have a plan for establishing, embedding and sustaining a diversity, equity and inclusion strategy. And we think this is really leading edge work. This is luminary work. Every school needs to commit to turning whatever their vision is for DEI work into provision for children, for the staff that they work with. And I think that we both stand very strongly in the camp that says that this is ethical work. So every school leader, needs a leader who is prepared and charged with driving forward this agenda. It's the work that is going to change the way that schools are. Han.
Thanks, babe. And I think one of the things that's coming up for us is the fact that, I mean, in the last few years, we've had the white paper about mental health, and every school's now nominating someone to lead on mental health. And we would like to see in the future that actually every school is not only naming someone to lead DEI work, but they're remunerating them as well. And they've got a clear remit and role and responsibility, because a lot of people are being asked to do this work in addition at the moment to being a head of year, or in addition to being a head of house. And I think actually we need to carve out the space for this to be a role and expertise and responsibility that every school actually needs. But we have got a lot of head teachers in our first cohort and in our second cohort starting in January, because they want to be upskilled and confident and competent in this space in order to then sort of like help someone else drive the strategy. So we've talked about allyship already, and I think that's really our commitment to this, is about how can we make this strategic? How can we make this a collective responsibility, a shared vision, that it is about creating inclusive schools? And a word that comes up a lot now, when you look, I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot, and I look at sort of like EDI leads in corporate spaces. A lot of them are now calling themselves head of belonging. And I actually really like that as a title or as a frame, because surely as educators and as school leaders, we want to create schools where every single child belongs and every single member of staff belongs. And when you actually truly begin to listen to people's experience in the school system, a lot of people don't feel that sense of belonging. So I think that might be a way in to actually lead this work with our teams, because not everyone will be on board from the get-go, to actually think about how can we collectively actually create a sense of belonging for every single individual in our school communities. And ultimately, those schools will then be as safe emotionally, psychologically and physically as possible for every single person to come to as well. So how is the programme delivered? It's a wholly virtual programme, okay, which makes it accessible. At the moment, we are running the programme on Wednesdays. We've got a Wednesday morning group and we've got a Wednesday afternoon group starting in the new year. But Angie and I are open to the timing and the day of these sessions. They're all delivered via Zoom in a closed group. They are all recorded, but only the people who are on the programme get access to those recordings, because it is a safe space and the sharings are quite deep. We have some intersessional research tasks where we don't necessarily tell people what to do, but we give them ideas of the kind of things they should be doing to scope out in between sessions, what sort of conversations they should be having, what kind of data they should be looking at. As we've said, we're both head teachers and we're both leading in this space, both in the grassroots, but also in the system. And there's opportunities then for the kind of the coaching to help enhance the work, but we're also putting together signposting of other resources, other training, other reading, because what we're trying to do through this course is actually create a commitment to us all leaning into the learning and the knowledge that we need to acquire in order to be confident and competent in this space. And it's an ongoing commitment to what we're going to read and what we're going to learn and how we're going to cascade and disseminate that learning. So when what we delivered, we do 10 sessions. So the actual core content is 8 sessions of 2.5 hours. And we top and tail it with an information session where everyone meets each other and we share our contexts. And then we have a celebration session at the end where hopefully they'll be sharing the journey they've been on and the legacy they're creating in their own schools. And then we have 2 audit tasks. One looks at staffing and one looks at the curriculum in between. The target audience, it's really up to you as a school where you position this, and it's an interesting mix of people in our first cohort. We have got a number of head teachers and executive head teachers and teaching school leads because they want to be the ones leading this at a systemic level, and then they're going to nominate other staff to come on to future cohorts. Some schools have sent 2 people because they see that actually this is a massive job for one person to do, and by empowering 2 people to come on the cohort, they can then work together. So I think it depends on you and your thinking about where this sits, whether or not it sits with one of your SLT, with yourself, or whether you're going to carve out a role for somebody to have a pastoral curriculum responsibility to become that DEI activist, that strategic lead within your school. And I think by giving it a title, giving it a remit, it also elevates the gravitas of the commitment from the institution to this work as well. Back to you, Angie.
Thanks, Hannah. I want to say that I think behind this programme sits a spirit of Ubuntu, in that I very strongly believe that we're only as strong as the weakest members of any group. And we have constructed a programme that wants to take account of the fact that people are not always where they want to be, that schools are not always where they want to be, that as individuals we're not always as expert as we would want to be in the field. And so this programme is about a non-judgmental approach to diversity, equity and inclusion. It's a practical programme that will enable you to set out a route map for yourself that is sustainable. But as Hannah said, we hold closed sessions and hold a very, very deliberately safe space, inclusive space, so that we can get to the heart of where people actually are. We cannot move forward unless we have a space that enables us to be honest enough about where we are. And we want to honour everybody for raising their hand and saying that they're prepared to do the work, rather than judging where they are on their particular part of the journey. So what does the journey look like? As Mike said, the programme runs over the course of several months. The first, and we top and tail the programme. So you'll have an introductory session where you'll meet everybody, introduce yourself. Then we move into our first formal session, which is about the kind of case law behind diversity, equity and inequalities work. We very much set the scene of why this work is necessary for institutions, because there is a legal framework behind it. And that legal framework might look different according to where you are, but there nevertheless is a legal framework for the work. And sometimes this is really helpful for people because it reminds us that there is power to our elbow. This isn't about us as individuals saying, I think that our school should be run like this. It's actually saying that in compliance with the law, we are running our school like this. In the second session, we move much more into the kind of social justice case for it. So we are deepening the personal perspective, and we are going to give you the opportunity to think about the social justice case for the work. We're going to give you the opportunity to explore some of the key terms, some of the terminology that we touched on earlier, and really positioning yourself as the leader of this work and thinking about where you come from, where you stand, and to what extent you want your school to reflect a certain set of values, but also where you stand as an ally for some of these issues. In session 3, we start to look at how you can bridge your personal perspective, your perspective as a school leader, your values with those of your staff. So we really start to think about the culture of the staff body that you have, and also their experience with DEI work. And we're going to offer you some tools around auditing the staff and thinking about the needs that some of the staff might have before moving into session 4, where we really identify the training needs that they're going to have. So this is where we can begin to think about whether it is unconscious bias training that you need, whether it's mediation training that you need, whether or not you're going to need to do a whole series of events around how we talk to young people and parents from diverse backgrounds. And so session 4 is the starting point to your plan around CPD for your teams. In session 5, and deliberately not until the middle of the programme, we start to look at the curriculum, because both Hannah and I have talked about this a lot. You can't start meddling with the curriculum until you're really sure about where your school stands on the issues of diversity, equity and inclusion. And so by the time we get to session 5, you will have increasing confidence about why you might want to look at a more diverse curriculum in support of young people and also in support of your own values. And in session 6, we begin to plan that out, and we might have some support from other members of Hannah's Diverse Educators there who have some expertise in diversifying the curriculum. Session 7, we look at how you're going to move into implementing your policies and your procedures, some of your systems around the work that we have been exploring, and really start to look at how we can embed that work for the future, look at our planning over the next few years. And in session 8, you are going to start to pinpoint who is going to drive forward the plan. You can be somebody that is standing at the head of this in the short term, but you are going to need to have a really, really sustainable plan for the other people who are going to be involved in delivering on diversity, equity and inclusion over the next 3 to 5 years. This is not a programme that is just about what you're going to do in a day, in a month, in this year. This is about changing your school so that you are confident at all times having conversations with anybody about your approach to diversity, equity and inclusion. And we want to get you to a celebratory point, the point where you can really start to say, come and have a look at what we're doing in our school. And that means that you need to have a long-term and embedded approach.
Thank you. So in year 1, I think one of the other strengths is you are surrounded by a peer support group. So Mike is now in a group with 12 other people plus Angie and I, who are all walking this path, and they have got a shared Google Drive. They're in a DM group on Twitter. They've got ways to connect and share the load, because actually if everyone's doing things like a curriculum audit and they're diversifying the curriculum, how can we actually cascade that work and sort of like box clever with our time and our energy and share our expertise cross organisation as well. So we cap the group at 20 because we want to keep the space quite small and quite intimate so that we can do the really personalised work. And if people book individually onto the programme, it's £500 per person for the whole duration, the 10 months, so the 10 sessions over the 10 months. However, if BSME wanted to create their own cohort, we could negotiate and bring that down slightly so that there's some value for money for the BSME schools group. There are pros and cons for your school leaders being in a cohort just of UAE leaders or BSME leaders, or coming into a group that is mixed with other leaders from other parts of the world. In our current cohort, we have both independent and maintained schools. We have primary and secondary, we have grammar, we have small trust, we have big trust, and we have international. And I do think the diversity within that group is actually really powerful. However, if we want to work on a system piece with you, then you might want to have your own group. So that's just one of the things to consider. Through the course of the duration of the programme, as I say, we're going to be collating that toolkit of resources, not just Angie and I, but all of us collectively. So that Google Drive is there for everyone to upload documents that they are using, policies they've rewritten, to actually begin to sort of like sow some seeds and to think about the wider piece of how you can spotlight and tweak every single practice and policy within your school context. I've mentioned the reading list already, and that peer support group I think is really, really important. Once the programme has finished, we are still available for ongoing support. So Angie, do you want to just spotlight some of the year 2 options?
Yeah, so we have some coaching available. We're in year 2, and that's because quite a lot of the time things come out of the plan, things arise that schools need additional support with, and so we're offering group coaching, which would be £200 per participant, and we're looking at probably 4 to 5 coachees per group. One of the things I would say is that that's probably where the mediation work comes. It's probably when people say, we've just started doing this bit of work with this group of parents and this is what's come up. And so coaching around that can be really, really helpful. Both Hannah and I offer consultancy, so we can not come into your schools, but we can certainly visit you online if you want half a day or a full day visit. And in year 2, that would very much be about the delivery of the plan. Inevitably, things are going to come up that make you feel as though this plan needs to be derailed. And so some consultancy or support around keeping the plan on track might be supportive to you in the second year. And of course, we're always available for staff training, for insets, for keynotes, for leadership development. Really, really great to start working with governors and trustees on this work as well, to ensure that you've got all of the support that you need. And so any particular bespoke or bespoke training that you feel you need for your teams or for yourself, we will be available for in year 2.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's the kind of the whistle-stop tour of who we are, what we do, why we do it, and how you might want to engage with us. We've got 6 minutes left, I think. Please do pop any comments or questions of things we haven't perhaps addressed, and they can be directed at either Angie, Mike, or myself. So please do fire away. Whilst you're composing them, I just wanted to say thank you, Alan, for your comment back to Mike about the Instagram account. And I had a quick scan with myself, Mike, a second ago, and I think the term that comes to mind for me is microaggressions. And some of those citations of things that have been said to them is one of the things we talk about quite a lot, around kind of like how we can avoid those microaggressions that perhaps aren't meant in the way they are articulated, but how they're received is really, really important to that person's identity. Olivia, can you update on the plan then? Are you able to do audio on this call or not? I don't know whether Olivia is a participant or a presenter in this space. Whilst Cheryl's sorting that out, Alan's got a question about, do we have any schools with more than one person? We've got MATs with more than one person, Alan. So we've got a primary school MAT where we've got the executive head of 2 of the schools and the teaching school lead, and they wanted to do it together so that they could then do the work strategically together as the legacy piece. For cohort 2 in January, and I think we need to thank Mike for this, we've got the 2 deputy heads from Singapore College on. They're coming to do it together, and that was an agreement from their head that both deputy heads wanted to work together. I think one's pastoral lead and one's curriculum lead, and they can then sort of like drive the agenda through both of their remits within the school. So I think if your school can afford it, I do think it's quite a big ask for one person to do this work. So it might be that you send a leader in one cohort and then a senior leader perhaps, and a middle leader in a future cohort. But if you do want to send 2, I think that would be a great model.
Alan, it's a really good idea to send 2 people, because I think it's a lot for one person to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheryl, can Olivia join in from an audio point of view? Do we know?
Yeah,
I'm on. I should be on now.
Hi, Olivia.
Hi. Just in terms of where BSME are up to in this journey, I mean, the discussion with Mike in the summer really paved the way for the collaboration that we have with Hannah and Angie. After I'd looked at the Insta account that Mike had referred me to, within 24 hours, Hannah and I were on the phone talking about the options available for the year. And I also got in touch with Colin Bell at COBIS and Jane Larson at CIS really quickly, so that we could ensure that as the membership organization serving the most schools in this region, that we were aware of each other's work, advising useful colleagues, etc. But also exploring the resources that were available to schools, and we continue that work together as well. But what we realized is that as a BSME team, we needed some training, and Hannah did training for our team a couple of weeks ago, and it's that training that will now inform a review of our own systems and processes, and that will drive our work forward in the next year. In terms of how we're bridging the gap for BSME school leaders, today's webinar is the starting point of that. And following today's webinar, we'll be promoting Angie and Hannah's course for BSME leaders with this potential of a BSME cohort. DIE practices in schools are really deep learning. And so as an organization, I'm clear that we are not going to rush into creating resources for schools to complete or audit or reviews. This takes time, this takes work. And that is why we are going to be promoting the course that Hannah and Angie are leading. We are not the experts in this field, and there's absolutely no way that we could deliver anything near what Hannah and Angie are able to do. We will also be drip feeding little bits and pieces of the incredible resources that they've shared with us in newsletters, on our social media channels. We were made very aware of some of the social media elements of how we were posting, and we've already started updating some of our social media images so that they are more representative. We didn't realize that a hashtag, each word had to start with a capital letter, otherwise text reading for people that are hearing impaired didn't pick up the separate words. So for us as a team, this has been a journey. We're grateful to Mike for being so honest with us, because we never would have known that this was going on if leaders hadn't spoken out. And Mike was really the first leader to speak out about this. So if there is anything that you're aware of as country representatives that we need to address, please let us know. We will keep going back to Hannah and Angie for support in this arena, and Mike, if we need any leadership contextual experiences, and from you, of course, we'll be coming back to you too, if that's okay. So I just wanted to share where we were up to, but we're incredibly grateful for your work, Angie. Thank you, Hannah. So grateful for this work that you're doing.
Well, thank you for having us, Olivia, because I mean, we've had a flurry of CEOs contacting us since September, but quite a lot of them are, can you come into unconscious bias for 1 hour on Tuesday? Tick, and it's done. And that's not how we work, as you know. And I think your openness, your team's openness, Mike's openness, like this is how we want to work. We want to be here as critical friends and as supporters for the long term, not as a kind of flash in the pan kind of situation. And our work's constantly evolving as well. Like we're being asked to do things that are out of our comfort zones on a regular basis, but we will go away and do the research and do the reading and do the learning to then disseminate and cascade, because actually asking a full-time school leader to start from zero and getting their head around all of this is a massive ask as well. So Alan wins the prize for already emailing me to book a place in the programme. So thank you very much, Alan. I will respond to your email in a second. I will follow up with a lot of the links with Cheryl to send out to you all, because we've got two places I know. We've got a lot of free stuff happening. So governance in particular, we've got a free webcast series starting for diverse governance. We've also got a free event next Saturday for my colleague Benny's Diversity in the Curriculum book launch. So I really do recommend you go onto the Diverse Ed website and sign up to the newsletter, because I'll signpost any activity we've got going. And it might be that you want a couple of you to do our programme, but there's other CPT we offer as well. And you can then cascade it down to other members of your staff. So you've got a workforce, a task force working on it. So I'm conscious of the time. Thank you very much for all of your time and interest this morning. And we look forward to hearing from you all. So thank you very much for having us, Cheryl and Olivia.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers, such important discussions and topics. Thank you to Hannah Wilson, Angie Brown, and Mike Lambert, with some comments from Olivia Roth. This session has been recorded and will be shared with our school members with all of the links that Hannah has commented on. I'll include that in the email to all of our school members. Thank you to everyone. I think we have a couple of people commenting. I'll just make sure that there are no questions. I would suggest if this is added to tomorrow's BSME session in Dubai.
A few people have asked Cheryl about sharing the slides, and that's absolutely fine. Please do feel free to share the slides around with the people who came to today's session.
I'll include that in the email.
Brilliant.
Right, I think that's probably, I think the rest of them are mostly thank yous. Mike's just commenting one last time. Right. Thank you very much to our speakers. We'll finish there.